Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would review this little video by this one channel named Dante's Boxing Nation. And he's going to be talking about Mr. Saul Canelo Alvarez's future and overall potentially who he could face or who he should face. And he's also going to be talking about Mr. Demetrius Boo Boo Andre, who, of course, has been one of the top contenders and one of the more talented fighters within the 154 and 160 pound divisions, and apparently, at least from what Dante has heard, because apparently he was talking to a source from the Demetrius Andrade camp, and I believe it because Dante has talked to professional sources in the past. He does have a lot of, overall avenues to talk to them, so I do believe it. And he's been promoting Demetrius Andrade for a very, very long time. But, anyways, when it comes down to it, Demetrius Boo Boo Andrade, there is a possibility that if he cannot get a good fight at 160, that he will move up to 168. And of course, because of the way the WBO organization works, I believe that would mean that Demetrius Andrade would immediately be put in a WBO interim fight, I believe, and that would mean that if he does win that fight, which I'm guessing he will, because I don't know if it would be against that elite of an opponent, but we'll have to see. That would mean more than likely that Demetrius Boo Boo Andrade, that he would probably be Mr. Saul Canelo Alvarez's mandatory. If Canelo Alvarez does decide to still hold on to those 168-pound titles. In my opinion, more than likely, Canelo Alvarez, he is probably not going to be holding on to those 168-pound titles because I believe that Canelo Alvarez, at least more than likely from the plan that I have been hearing, and I heard this from Blue Blood Sports TV, and I already guessed this pretty much prior to this, but Canelo Alvarez, after the Makabu fight, he's going to be going after 175. I don't think that he's going to be interested at 168, at least for a little bit. I think that it's possible after Canelo Alvarez maybe tries to unify 175. If he does that, and I do believe that he potentially will, then maybe he can face a Jamal Charlo, David Benavidez. But Demetrius Andrade, in my opinion, I don't think that's Saul Canelo Alvarez, and I have a lot of respect for Saul Canelo Alvarez. I do believe that he is the current number one pound for pound fighter. I believe that he actually is the most skilled boxer in the world, at least of today. But when it comes down to it, I don't think that anyone, including Saul Canelo Alvarez, is rushing into a fight with Demetrius Boo Boo Andrade. Now, some people may ask me, well, you said in the past that Artur Beterbiev and Dimitri Bivol, that they're the biggest threats to Canelo Alvarez. Make it make sense. How come Canelo, he'll be willing to face those guys, but, he's not willing to face Demetrius Boo Boo Andrade? Well, you must understand. Sometimes when a fighter sees a big threat or a fighter that's a little bit too tricky for their, for what they're worth at a certain weight division, especially when they're similar in size, it would be more embarrassing if you possibly lose that fight because you're similar in size to that guy compared to that of an Artur Beterbiev or Dimitri Bivol. So, of course, that means that there's, more legacy on the line basically for Canelo when it comes down to it, or it would possibly lead to a more embarrassing loss if he were to lose to Demetrius Andrade. But I just don't personally see Saul Canelo Alvarez taking the Demetrius Andrade fight. It's not necessarily that I don't think that Canelo Alvarez, like I said, I've never been on this narrative that Saul Canelo Alvarez just ducks and avoids everyone. I've never been on that narrative. But I don't think that anyone, whether it be Canelo or Jamal Charlo or Billy Joe Saunders or, anyone, possibly even David Benavidez, I don't think that anyone is going to take that fight unless they're trapped into a corner. Demetrius Andrade has what I like to call the Cuban fighter syndrome. Basically, a fighter that, very, very talented when it comes down to it, decently slick, and, he is one of the top contenders, but no one is going to be rushing into a fight to fight you. And it's going to be very hard to get some of the bigger fights because even though Andrade, he does have a small, cult of fans when it comes down to it, he just does not have a big enough fan base, in my opinion. And I don't know if he really sells out arenas the way that a Jamal Charlo and David Benavidez would. And I'm not sure if they 100% sell out arenas the way that other fighters may. But at the end of the day, I do think that Saul Canelo Alvarez, just the way that he has talked about them, I think that he certainly is interested in a David Benavidez and Jamal Charlo fight. I just think that he's going to fight them a little bit later on down the line. But the only fight that I have never seen Canelo Alvarez be personally interested in was a Demetrius Andrade fight, because Demetrius Andrade, he is very tricky. He's a slick fighter, and on top of that, like I said, I think that Canelo realizes, at least at the current moment in time, that Demetrius Andrade, he's just a little bit too tricky for what he's worth. Kind of like that of an Sonny Lara or Guillermo Rigondeaux or, really a lot of the Cuban fighters. Or Devin Haney at the current moment at 135. So if Demetrius Andrade is going to get that Saul Canelo Alvarez fight, in my opinion, what is he going to have to do? The only clear answer, in my opinion, is to either go after a Jamal Charlo, and Jamal Charlo has expressed very clearly that he's not willing to go after Demetrius Andrade. So there's only one fighter, in my opinion, that you can face, especially if you're going to 168. Try to get that fight with David Benavidez. David Benavidez says that he's willing to take on all comers. He says that he wants to face all the fighters. So that means what? That means that David Benavidez, and that means all in all that Demetrius Andrade, they should get a fight set up sometime within the next year. Because apparently those are the two boogeymen. No one wants to face those fighters. Whoever wins that fight is going to get a hell of a lot of acclaim. And whoever wins that fight, it is going to put a massive amount of pressure on Saul Canelo Alvarez if he does not take that fight. So in my opinion, that is the answer for Mr. Demetrius Andrade. And some people may say, well, that's not fair. Why does he have to do that? Listen, life at the end of the day is not fair for a lot of people. It just is what it is. But Demetrius Andrade, he's going to have to work twice as hard as any of the other contenders because, like I said, no one is completely interested in fighting him. It just is what it is. It's unfortunate, but that's just the way the cookie crumbles sometimes. So like I said, to get that Canelo fight or to get a big fight with a certain amount of other people, he's going to have to defeat a David Benavidez. And that way, he may be able to trap Jermall Charlo in a corner, or maybe a Saul Canelo Alvarez, or maybe Saul Canelo Alvarez will finally say, he's finally at least worth the trouble. So it is what it is. Anyways, we'll see overall what happens with that. But anyways, Dante's Boxing Nation, he's going to be talking about it. Let's tune in.
The contract multiple times, that's what I was telling you.
Dante's Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? Now, did you just hear right there what Ed Ferris said, Demetrius Andrade's manager? We're starting to notice the pattern when it comes to the zone. There's always a big-name fighter that the zone, they feel that maybe they paid too much money and they didn't put in the contract, we're only going to pay you this money as long as you fight the guys that we approve. This is what happened with Canelo. This is what happened with Golovkin. And now you hear Demetrius Andrade's manager saying that the zone wants to renegotiate a contract because now they feel that they are paying Demetrius Andrade too much money. But the difference from Andrade and Golovkin and Canelo is while Andrade is actually trying to fight the best fighters in the world, Canelo and Golovkin, they're the ones that are trying to milk the cow. They're the ones taking advantage of...
Well, like I said, you can talk all this shit about Saul Canelo Alvarez at the end of the day, and like I said, I get it. Demetrius Andrade is a fight that, just like everyone else, he hasn't been rushing, overall, to take that fight. I get it. But at the end of the day, Saul Canelo Alvarez, on average, has usually fought very, very decent competition. Like I said, there's only so much you can say about a fighter that has fought Sonny Lara and Austin Trout and Miguel Cotto and Sergey Kovalev and Billy Joe Saunders, Callum Smith, Caleb Plant, and, Danny Jacobs, and I mean, the list goes on. And Gennady Golovkin, of course.
Situation and trying to fight the easiest competition for the most money. I keep telling you, Canelo Alvarez fans, you can't have it both ways. If you're going to say that Canelo is the best fighter in the world, you would have to admit that Andrade is actually going after the best fighters according to your own logic. But let's go back to the zone and the many...
Well, yes, Demetrius Andrade is trying to get that fight with Saul Canelo Alvarez, and I do think that Canelo is the best fighter in the world. But like I said, Demetrius Andrade, he's probably not going to get that fight unless he takes a big fight himself. Now, it's just going to be very tricky, but like I said, it's very unfortunate. Like I said, it's in the Guillermo Rigondeaux type of situation. What did Guillermo Rigondeaux eventually have to do because none of the people within his own weight division were to face him? But Demetrius Andrade actually has a little bit of a better opportunity than that of a Guillermo Rigondeaux, in my opinion. He has that David Benavidez ticket if David Benavidez is willing to fight him. What Demetrius Andrade should be willing to do is call out David Benavidez. Because you're not going to get the Jermall Charlo fight or Canelo Alvarez fight just by purely calling them out. Because at the end of the day, like I said, they both have said the same thing about Demetrius Andrade, that he don't fight nobody and all sorts of stuff. So what they're basically saying is that I'm not going to fight you unless overall I have to. It just is what it is.
These contracts they've created. This is the reason why Canelo Alvarez broke the contract, because Canelo wanted to fight Yildirim, and the zone, they started to realize they were paying Canelo Alvarez way too much money for him to be fighting against weak opposition that no fans wanted to watch. So when the zone didn't...
Well, that's not really overall the problem. The problem is that they wanted that Gennady Golovkin trilogy. And apparently Oscar De La Hoya put that in the contract, and Canelo Alvarez said, "I never agreed to the Gennady Golovkin trilogy." So that's why overall he backed out of that contract. Because on the zone, Canelo did face decent competition, at least here and there. Like I said, he fought Callum Smith on there. He fought Sergey Kovalev, and he also fought Billy Joe Saunders. All those guys at the time were at least A- fighters.
Prove the Yildirim fight. That's when Canelo Alvarez said, if I can't fight whoever I want out of this contract. And that's exactly what he got. And his opponent is having the same problem with Gennady Golovkin. They gave Golovkin this huge 6-fight deal, and they allowed Golovkin to fight the weakest opposition ever. He got to fight Steve Rose. I don't know how
Well, Steve Rose was an undefeated black fighter. So he was going on this soul food diet, right, Dante? Because apparently Gervonta Tank Davis, like, he's facing Isaac Cruz and Mario Barrios, two people that, were Mexican fighters, but didn't even, win any of the official belts in their career. And apparently they're some of the best Mexican fighters out there. Don't get me wrong, they're somewhat talented, but they're not A-grade fighters. Like, come on.
allowed Golovkin to fight a says Meta, but they allowed the fight, and now reports are Golovkin wanted to fight another soft touch, and that's when DAZN finally put their foot down and told him that they weren't.
And I agree that Gennady Golovkin has not been facing that elite competition, especially within the past few years. And this is what I've been saying about both Gennady Golovkin and Deontay Wilder for an extremely long time. These same channels, when it came to Deontay Wilder, they always loved to jerk off about, oh, well, Deontay, he has these 10 title defenses. He's an all-time great heavyweight. You have 10 title defenses, but who did you really defend it against? I mean, you beat Luis Ortiz, I'll give you that. Luis Ortiz is a top contender, but besides that, I mean, is anyone really going to remember Bermain Severn as a good fighter? Is anyone really going to remember Artur Spiltzka or Johan Duapis or, Bermain, not Bermain Severn, but Dominic Brazil, that one dude with the man titties? like no one is going to remember any of those fighters overall as all-time great fighters. It just is what it is. So that's why when you take a look at title defenses, I'm very strict on it. Like I said, to me, title defenses are great, but they only really matter if you're facing, decent competition at least. That's why when people, they talk about, Deontay Wilder or, Gennady Golovkin or something, it's like, it is great to a degree. But at the end of the day, we have to take a look at how many big fights that they were in. It just is what it is. All right. Same thing with Bernard Hopkins when he was defending his middleweight titles. So many people always love to say about how he was this all-time great fighter and in the top 10. Besides Jermaine Taylor, who did he really face that was really decently talented, overall within the middleweight division? I mean, he beat Felix Tito Trinidad. Don't get me wrong, who was very decent at the middleweight division. But besides Felix Tito Trinidad and Jermaine Taylor, all those title defenses that he had, I don't know one of them. I don't know one of them. It just is what it is.
Going to pay for any more says matters and the Rose fights. The only reason they're allowing the Murata fight is because he does have a belt. Now, with that summary, let's go ahead and get into the actual news. So that clip I played for you guys at the beginning of this video with Andrade's manager, it gives you an idea of what's going on. Now, for those of you guys who've been following my channel since day one, you know I haven't done a single interview or a live video in over 2 years. But I'm still talking to professional boxers, trainers, managers, etc., etc. I just don't share the information because they're personal conversations. For example, I was talking to a very, very direct source when it comes to the team Andrade. And he told me about a week or 2 weeks ago, but he said he didn't want me to report on it because they were trying to figure out if they were going to get a Charlo fight. But he told me that DAZN, they did not want to pay for Andrade to fight against his mandatory, who's an undefeated fighter from Kazakhstan. His name is Janabek. I'm not even going to try to say his last name. But because this guy doesn't have a big name, DAZN doesn't want to pay for the fight. And now you hear Eddie Hearn confirming all of this because he just said right now that Andrade, he has his mandatory, but Janabek is not a big enough fight. So if they can't get a big fight at middleweight, they're moving up to 168. Now, here's the really interesting.
And I doubt that they'll be able to get a big fight at 168. I don't know any oncomers that are going to be willing to face him. It's not going to be Jamal Charlo. Jamal Charlo is not interested in facing any A-class fighters. So it just is what it is.
Because Andre is the WBO champion, once he moves up to 168, he automatically gets a shot at the WBO interim belt, which once he wins that fight, it makes him the mandatory for Canelo Alvarez. Bad news for Canelo and bad news for Canelo Alvarez fans. Because Canelo fans, they will still be here and try to justify and try to sell you on why Canelo versus Makabu is a great fight. Once the opponent is weak.
Well, Makabu, like I said, he's not fighter of the year. He's not an A-grade fighter. But it's an interesting fight because, like I said, it's a title chase for history. So once again, I understand why Canelo was going after it. Like I said, I understand overall why the media is really trying to push that fight because, like I said, they're going to push Canelo Alvarez eventually as debatably the greatest fighter of all time. They're going to do that because, like I said, you know, the plans for Canelo, I believe, next, not only to go after Makabu, but after that, he's going to go to 175.
Talk real good about.
So in other words, do I believe that Canelo more than likely will vacate his 168 titles, at least at the current moment in time? More than likely.
The opponent. Canelo fans talk real good about Makabu. They talk real good about Yildirim. They talk real good about Caleb Plant, Smith.
Well, Yildirim overall is not an A-grade fighter. Caleb Plant and Callum Smith and Billy Joe Saunders, all those guys are at least on the A- level, which is pretty much the same level that I have Demetrius Boo Boo Andrade. So it is what it is. You know, like I said, if you want to argue that Demetrius Andrade is a bigger threat than those fighters, you can go ahead. In my opinion, he's around the same level. You know, it just is what it is. But when it comes down to it all in all, like I said, I would like to see the Demetrius Andrade fight, but I can't blame Canelo Alvarez too much, or I can't get after him too much if he's going to go to UNIFY 175 pounds. Because in my opinion, the biggest threats to sue Canelo Alvarez actually are Mr. Dimitri Bivol and Artur Beterbiev. So, like I said, people can allege that he's ducking all these fighters all they want to. Listen, I don't think that Canelo Alvarez, like I said, I don't think that he's rushing into a Demetrius fight, you know, either. But at the end of the day, if he goes and faces, you know, Artur Beterbiev and Dimitri Bivol, and those are two fights that are going to be looked at as 50-50 or favorite fights for Canelo. So it's not like it's going to be a Mikey Garcia, Errol Spence situation. You know, Canelo at the end of the day, he'll have to perform well in those fights. Those are going to be big legacy fights. So I cannot get after him, you know, basically for facing those fighters.
Etc., etc. But all of a sudden, when the opponent is dangerous, actually has a chance of winning, then all of a sudden, all the things you would have expected them to say about Makabu, Yildirim, Plant, or whoever else, they make sure that they say it about that dangerous fighter. Who has he fought? He's a horrible fighter. He's a bum.
Well, listen, I agree that certain Canelo Alvarez fans, you know, that they made excuses all in all to why Canelo has not fought Andrade and that he's a horrible fighter. Listen, for those of us that are logical and objective, we know that Andrade is not a horrible fighter. But what I will say is this: do I think that he has the? Do I think that all in all that he has the skill set to beat Canelo? Probably not. I just don't see it. I maybe would give him a 30% chance just because he's, you know, taller and he can be a little bit slick, but I don't think Demetrius Andrade, first of all, his chin, in my opinion, can be a little bit too open sometimes. On top of that, he can get a little bit too sloppy. I don't think that he has the type of power to really bother Canelo either. That doesn't mean that he has bad power, but I just don't. I don't think that I don't think that he has the real A grade power, in my opinion, to really bother Canelo. This is why, you know, when people they talk about, well, you know, Canelo needs to face top contenders with power. There's no fighter out there, especially within the 168-pound divisions, at least from what I've seen so far. And I'm not, you know, going to include David Morrell as of yet because David Morrell is heavily inexperienced in professional boxing as of yet because he only has like 6 fights. So I'm not going to include him quite as of yet. But David Benavidez and Andre, those are not fighters with A-grade power. They can hurt you, but, you know, they're not fighters with A-grade power. Now, if you're talking about a Jamal Charlo does have A-grade power. But the problem with Jamal Charlo is that he does not have an A-plus boxing skill set. But we'll see what happens.
Only wants a payday. And the funny thing about the whole payday talk is, as you guys seen in this clip, or you heard in the clip that I played earlier on, we just heard Demetrius Andrade's own manager admit that the zone is paying Demetrius Andrade $3 to $4 million a fight, no matter who he fights, right? Do you know what that means? That means the majority of Canelo Alvarez's last opponents, they weren't making anywhere close to what Demetrius Andrade makes right now before they fought Canelo Alvarez. So he says,
well, there has been overall questions about, Demetrius Andrade and Devin Haney, for example. They may be getting paid that much, but there has been questions behind the scenes about have the investments returned in the same favor. Because Demetrius Andrade, even though I think that, like I said, he has somewhat of a fan base, is anyone really, oh my God, Demetrius Andrade fights Friday night. I gotta watch that fight. Is anyone really saying that about Demetrius Boo Boo Andrade? I mean, don't get me wrong. I like watching him. He's a decent fighter, but I don't think that thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people are just waiting for Demetrius Andrade's next fight, because, like I said, he's not someone that, when I take a look at him, at least from what I've seen, that has a very, very big fan base. He has a decent fan base when it comes down to, like, he has the same amount of a fan base as like a Guillermo Rigondeaux had, and an Araceli Lara had, but that's just not that big. Once again, that's not me saying that the fight should not happen between Andrade and Canelo one day, but like I said, I can understand, maybe why Canelo has not went after him, because, like I said, he may be just a little bit too tricky for overall what he's worth. And on top of that, there's fights out there that, in my opinion, you could debate are bigger challenges anyway. So it just is what it is.
the highest paid boxer, who's been calling him out for 6 years, wants a payday. But then Canelo goes after the fighters that really, really do need a payday. And we know they needed a payday because even when Canelo first offered all of them a fight, Plant, Smith, Kovalev, and even Saunders, when Canelo first offered them a fight, all of them asked for more money. And Canelo obliged them all. We know what time it is, don't we? Man, do you guys know how bad Canelo Alvarez is going to look if Andrade moves up to 168, becomes his mandatory after chasing this man?
Like I said, it's not really going to matter because, like I said, Canelo, he probably will vacate his title. In fact, he's probably not even just going to vacate that title. He's probably going to vacate them all. It just is what it is. He's probably going to vacate all the 168 titles at the current moment in time. And he's probably just going to, become the try to be unified at 175. So, like I said, it's really not going to be that much pressure on Canelo Alvarez at the end of the day because, like I said, most people, including myself, look at 175 overall as a bigger challenge anyway. Which, in my opinion, it is, especially if it's Beterbiev than Bivol.
And for 6 years through 3 different weight classes, and you guys have to remember, Demetrius Andrade was the champion at 154. Canelo was Andrade's mandatory at 154. And the champion, Andrade, was calling.
These Demetrius Andrade fans have been alleging for so long about Demetrius Andrade. I remember watching Dante's Boxing Nation even several years earlier when I first got into modern day boxing and Demetrius Andrade first came on the scene. And Dante was always trying to allege that Demetrius Andrade was the best of 154 or, the greatest there. And I was like, how do you prove that? And then I started watching him and I was like, I just... Personally, this is my opinion about Demetrius Andrade. I do think he's a good fighter, but I've never been as impressed with him as many other people have been. I mean, I've seen his performances over Jack Colkay and Valenz Martirosyan and that one dude, Liam Williams. I'm sorry, but he don't impress me that much. It just is what it is. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that he can't pull off the upset against some of these other bigger fighters, maybe even possibly against Canelo. But do I see that likely happening? No.
Out the contender, Canelo Alvarez. Canelo turned down the fight. He waited until Andrade got stripped of the belt, and then Canelo, he fought for the vacant title against Liam Smith, just like he did at 168. Waited for Benavidez to be stripped of his belt to then fight Yildirim, or he tried to fight Yildirim. But once again, because the zone pulled the plug on that fight, WBC, they jumped in. They helped Canelo Alvarez get a title shot, and they just threw in the WBC belt when Canelo was fighting for Caleb Smith's belt. So my point is, that was damn near, 6 years years ago, and now fast forward to present day, and there's a very good chance that Andrade may become Canelo's mandatory, and he's going to force Canelo to either take the fight or vacate another belt. Canelo is going to go down.
And he probably will vacate the title. Because like I said, Canelo Alvarez's plans as of right now, they're not at 168. I think that eventually he'll return to 168. But when he returns there, I think more than likely he's going to face David Benavidez and Jamal Charlo. And by that time, we'll see what Demetrius Andrade has done. Because Demetrius Andrade, there's no offense against Demetrius Andrade, he's a decent fighter, but it's like, for you complaining all in all that you get so ducked and so avoided, it's like you can't get one A-grade fight out there. Not one. It's like, come on. So like I said, Demetrius Andrade, he's going to have to go after David Benavidez.
In history, as vacating more belts than any fighter has ever done in the past. Canelo vacated the WBC belt to avoid Gennady Golovkin. He vacated the WBC belt again to...
Yes, but then he fought Gennady Golovkin, so there's only so much that you can say about that. It just is what it is.
Avoid his mandatory Jamal Charlo. He vacated the IBF belt to avoid the Darren Yevchenko fight.
Oh, come on, man. No one thinks that Sergey Derevyanchenko is a real threat to anybody out there. The man couldn't even beat Danny Jacobs. Like, just stop. He's avoiding Sergey Derevyanchenko. No one's avoiding Sergey Derevyanchenko. Sergey Derevyanchenko is not that high quality of a fighter.
And it just gets worse for Canelo Alvarez. Because now, he no longer has the...
Like, when it comes down to it, is anyone, looking at Sergey Derevyanchenko and saying, oh my god, I want to see Sergey Derevyanchenko versus Canelo Alvarez? I didn't even want to see Sergey Derevyanchenko versus Jamal Charlo. Sergey Derevyanchenko is not a high-grade fighter. Like, come on, he's dunking Sergey Derevyanchenko. Yeah, he certainly is. That dude has lost every big fight in his career. That's like saying, Regis Prograis or, someone is dunking Adrian Broner. Like, come on, man.
WBC to protect him and give him some type of distraction, fake trophy designation to hide the fact that he vacated his belt to avoid a certain fighter. All of the headlines are going to read, Canelo Alvarez vacates his belt. But there's much more bad news for Canelo Alvarez. Not only does he have to worry about Andrade becoming his mandatory, he already has David Benavidez, who's his mandatory, and then he also is going to have to deal with David Morrell, who is the regular.
I don't think that he's worried about either David Benavidez or Jamal Charlo. I believe that those fights will happen eventually. The only fight that I question is the Demetrius Bulbo Andrade fight, because like I said, Canelo does not seem really interested at all in that fight. Pretty much just like everyone else, but it is what it is. But the David Benavidez Jamal Charlo fights, Canelo has stated multiple times that he does have interest in facing them. I just don't think that he's going to face them next year. I think that fight is going to happen sometime within the next couple of years. I think that if he unifies 175, excuse me, he's either going to make one or two moves. He's either going to go back down to 168 and face David Benavidez and Jamal Charlo in the same year, or he's going to try to go up to cruiserweight and maybe possibly unify there, or maybe he'll even face Alexander Usyk. We'll have to see.
WBA middleweight champion, super middleweight champion. You already know when it comes to the WBA, they're removing all of their additional belts, so eventually Canelo is going to have to fight against him as well. So Canelo Alvarez fans, who do you want to see Canelo Alvarez fight out of the bunch? They don't want Canelo Alvarez.
I want to see him face Artur Beterbiev, and I want to see him face Dimitri Bivol. And like I said, I'm not a fanboy of any of these fighters, but if you're asking me who the biggest threats towards Canelo are, it has to be Artur Beterbiev and Dimitri Bivol. Those are the only fighters that, in my opinion, are at least on the A, possibly even A+ skilled level for their divisions. They're decently skilled. They have very decent punching power, and yeah, they may be a little bit bigger than Canelo, so Canelo may be able to outslick them here and there, but some of those fighters, like I said, they're nothing to mess around with. Highly skilled fighters.
Alvarez to fight any of these guys. That's why they always say he can fight.
Now, all in all, he had Joe Smith Jr. in that bunch, so if Canelo, after Lunga Makabu, if he goes out to Joe Smith Jr., for which, from what I hear, I believe that he will. Are you going to give him credit? I highly doubt it, but we'll see what happens.
Whoever he wants. He can fight whoever he wants. How does a boxer fighting whoever he wants, no matter how easy the opponent is, how does that benefit you as a boxing fan? The only time it's going to benefit you is if you don't believe that guy can beat these fighters, therefore you're happy for him to just keep winning no matter who he fights. That's what the translation is.
I would agree with that, but like I said, at the end of the day, Canelo Alvarez, the majority of his career, at least ever since the Austrian Trout and Floyd Mayweather Jr. fights, he usually has been facing top-grade competition. That doesn't mean that I've liked every fight that he has taken, but he's fought a lot of A-grade fighters.
As long as I've been reporting news and making YouTube videos, have you ever heard me say a fighter in his prime can fight whoever he wants? It doesn't matter what the fans want to see. He can fight whoever he wants.
You won't say that specifically, Dante, but when it comes to the fighters that you like to defend, and like I said, we all know what you're about. It is what it is. You will make excuses for them, just like for, Mr. Isaac Cruz and Gervonta Tank Davis. Or Devin Haney versus Jojo Diaz. It just is what it is. Now, Jojo Diaz and Devin Haney, I didn't mind that fight because that was pretty much the only fight that Devin Haney had available. But Gervonta Tank Davis versus Isaac Cruz, for example, Isaac Cruz is decent, but he's just not a great fighter.
Never heard me say anything like that, right? And the crazy thing is, only when we're talking about Canelo having tough mandatory do we have to say it's bad news for Canelo. If we were talking about someone like Crawford, this would be great news because we know that Crawford would actually step up to the challenge. He would want to fight all of these tough mandatories. We know it.
Well, like I said, Terence Crawford allegedly, he wants to face this guy, and then he almost never ends up facing them. So how serious is he really? There's no offense against Terence Bud Crawford. Maybe he is serious about facing all of them. He does seem pretty decently confident, but like I said, Terence Bud Crawford, for talking all this shit, you've made a lot of dumbass mistakes overall, especially with signing Top Rank when none of the other elite welterweights were there. So it's like, come on, how serious were you really?
We were talking about Devin Haney. We were talking about Shakur Stevenson. This will be good news. It's bad news when it comes
to... And like I said, if Terence Bud Crawford is going to go on this bullshit when it comes down to about, I'm not taking the Errol Spence fight unless it's 50-50, that'll tell you overall who's serious about taking that fight and who's not.
To Canelo. The irony that Canelo Alvarez, he called Andrade a horrible fighter. I'm telling you guys right now, Canelo, he is going to look extremely horrible if he's forced to vacate all of his belts instead of taking on one of these tough challenges. Now, it would be different. The only way he can justify this slightly is if he moves up to 175 and he goes after all of the champions there. So the question is,
which in my opinion is exactly what he's going to do. But we'll see what happens.
It's always more interesting to see who Canelo Alvarez is going to choose as his next opponent as opposed to what's going to happen in the ring. The majority of Canelo Alvarez's most recent fights, I have predicted how they will play out. If you don't believe me, go back and watch my...
Yes, you predicted them wrong. Basically, all in all, what Dante's Boxing Nation always loves to say is that Canelo isn't that good. They completely outbox him, and then all in all, he eventually ends up knocking him out. Come on, man. If you know what you're watching, like I said, Billy Joe Saunders and Caleb Plant, they were able to escape with a few rounds over Canelo, but it's not like they were winning the fight. These guys overall love to say that Canelo was so down on the scorecards before Canelo Alvarez knocked him out. That's a bunch of horse shit. Billy Joe Saunders, like I said, I like Billy Joe. He's a decent boxer. But Billy Joe Saunders, when it came down to it, he was getting beat on the scorecards before Canelo Alvarez knocked him out. Is what it is. All right, I thought Billy Joe maybe pulled out a good 3 rounds out of that 8-round fight. But Canelo Alvarez, he was winning that fight. Just is what it is. When you talk about Caleb Plant, maybe out of that whole entire fight, maybe at most you can argue that he had 4 rounds. But Canelo was winning that fight.
Previous videos.
Even against Sergey Kovalev, because that's another one they try to debate. Sergey Kovalev was not winning that fight on the scorecards, in my opinion. It was competitive, and I thought Sergey was winning some of the rounds, but he was not landing enough flush punches.
I told you guys when it came to BJ Saunders and Plant that both of those fighters were going to outbox Canelo Alvarez, make him look extremely flawed, and that Canelo would stop them late. And I already told you guys what's going to happen.
Right, but that's not what happened. They would get some shots in on Canelo here and there, and I thought Caleb Plant and, Billy Joe Saunders won some rounds here and there, but all in all, Canelo was controlling the fight.
Happened in the Makabu fight. In the Makabu fight, because Makabu, he has no type of boxing ability, he has no defense, he has no chin, he has no speed. Canelo is going to stop him within 3 rounds.
No, Canelo, in my opinion, is not going to stop him within 3 rounds, but we'll see what happens. Makabu, like I said, he's not fighter of the year. But like I said, Makabu, he's at least a decent fighter. Like I said, that's why the fight's going to be interesting. But we'll see what happens.
Mark my words. It will look just like the Yildirim or the Rock.
But what I will say is this. Do I think Makabu has the skill set of a Callum Smith, Billy Joe Saunders, or Caleb Plant? No, I don't. Because in my opinion, those guys were at least on the A grade level. Makabu is at least a B grade fighter. But like I said, the fight is at least acceptable because, he's a cruiserweight.
Keep fielding fight. You know what a lot of you Canelo fans that try to defend Canelo don't understand is it's one thing to avoid one fighter, right? He's dangerous, etc., etc. But then instead of you fighting that dangerous fighter, you fight the other dangerous fighter and you beat him. For example, if Canelo would have avoided Andrade and he would have fought and beat Charlo or vice versa, it wouldn't look as bad. But the problem with Canelo Alvarez is he's avoiding everyone.
No, he's not. And this is why I've never been on Canelo Alvarez's ass that much. You can't sit here and tell me that Billy Joe Saunders and Caleb Plant are not dangerous fighters for anyone. It just is what it is. They're decently slick. They have decent boxing IQ. They're A-grade fighters. They were undefeated and champions for a reason. All right? Now, if you can tell which fighters, like I said, if you're a person that's intelligent enough and if you truly know what the hell is going on around you, you know which fighters, even if they're undefeated, you know which fighters are weak sauce and maybe garbage compared to fighters all in all that are actually talented. Caleb Plant, you can't beat Jose Uzcategui, who completely dominated Andre Dirrell within 2 fights, and, get a victory over that guy and just be complete trash. That doesn't make any sense. And then beat Caleb Truax, who at one point in time beat James DeGale. I don't think Caleb Truax is really an A-grade fighter, but, it is what it is. Still, he was able to get the victory. I also think he was able to get the victory over Pork Medina, but maybe I could be wrong. So like I said, at the end of the day, I know overall which champions are the real deal and which ones are not the real deal. Now, Rocky Fielding, Anthony Yildirim, at the end of the day, those are bums. we all understand that. But Caleb Plant, Billy Joe Saunders, and Callum Smith, all those guys are real deal fighters. All right, so it is what it is. So this narrative that Dante is saying, well, Canelo is avoiding everybody. No, he's not. No, he's not. All right, it is what it is.
David Benavidez, Charlo, Andre, and we don't know if he's going to avoid Bivol and Beterbiev at 175. But we know when it comes to seniority, Charlo and Andre, Canelo, he should have been in the ring with them long time ago. Now he just made it clear that he has no interest in fighting David Benavidez. Every other Mexican great that we know, they fought against other dangerous Mexican fighters. In fact, it's pretty ironic because the guy that's in Canelo's actual stable, Oscar Valdez, just like his idol Canelo, Oscar's avoiding undefeated, dangerous black fighters. But when he does it, he's fighting against other Mexican fighters. Canelo's not even willing to do what Oscar Valdez is willing to do, a fighter that looks up to Canelo Alvarez. Speaking of fighting against tough Mexican opponents, why do you Canelo Alvarez fans keep trying to compare?
I think the David Benavidez fight is a very decent fight to make. I believe that fight will actually happen because I think Canelo Alvarez sees that fight as worth it. I just don't think that he's going to go after it right now. I think that, once again, he has plans at 175, and then he plans to go after Charlo and David Benavidez, or he'll make a move to cruiserweight, could even face Alexander Usyk. I think he does look at the Jamal Charlo and David Benavidez fights as highly worth it because they have high value, and those fights could do a very, very big dollar. But the Demetrius Andrade fight, that might be one to where he says, it may be a little bit too much trouble for what it's worth. Because Demetrius Andrade, he's just not someone that, he's a very, very decent star in terms of boxing ability, but he's not a superstar. He's not someone that's a Gervonta Tank Davis or really even on the Charlo Benavidez level.
Canelo to Tank Davis, when even Tank Davis is fighting against all of the best Mexican fighters in 3 different weight classes. And then when you have Canelo, he's not.
I don't know how Gervonta Tank Davis, and I've always said this, Dante always tries to pull this bullshit out of his ass. Like, who are you fooling, dude? Like, this dude, apparently Gervonta Tank Davis, he's facing the best Mexican fighters in his weight divisions. Isaac Cruz is not even on the same level as a Ryan Garcia, dude. Like, come on, man. Isaac Cruz is a very decent fighter, don't get me wrong, but he's not A grade. And Mario Barrios, I mean, shit, he wasn't even the second best fighter there. He wasn't even the second best Mexican fighter there, at least in terms of accomplishments. I mean, Mario Barrios, maybe if you wanted to argue him over Jose Zepeda, you could, but he's not the best Mexican fighter there. That's Jose Ramirez.
Fighting the best undefeated black or Mexican.
No one takes a look at Mario Barrios and says, wow, that's a generational type of fighter right there. No one takes a look at him like that. It just is what it is.
Fighters. So how do you even make the comparison? On top of that, no one has ever called Tank Davis, including myself, no one has ever called Tank Davis pound for pound, even top 5, one of the best fighters in the world.
You've called him top 10 pound for pound. Yes, you have.
So why would you be comparing Canelo to someone who is not even ranked in the top 5? That's
no Canelo Alvarez fans, or no people all know who, like I said, no people all know who are ranking things logically and objectively. And like I said, I'm not a fanboy of any of these fighters. I just try to put my logical and objective, analysis on here. No one overall, like I said, who ranks things logically and objectively would compare Gervonta Tank Davis to a Canelo Alvarez. The only people who have been comparing Gervonta Tank Davis and Canelo Alvarez are really that of the LDBC and new media.
Like comparing Canelo Alvarez to some undefeated prospect.
Or Gervonta Tank Davis himself.
When it comes to who he's fighting. Gervonta really only hopped on the scene about a year ago. When it comes to at least receiving a lot of attention, Canelo Alvarez, he's been moving like this for almost a good 8 years, ever since he lost to Floyd Mayweather. And now he's trying to be like Gervonta Tank Davis? It doesn't even add up. It doesn't even make any sense.
I don't understand how he'd be trying to be like Gervonta Tank Davis. That doesn't make any sense at all. Because Gervonta Tank Davis is not even fighting dudes that are legitimate champions. At least Canelo is facing undefeated champions. So you can't even compare the two.
Let me just go ahead and make this very clear.
Now, like I said, Gervonta Tank Davis, in my opinion, very highly skilled fighter. Great, great, great fighter. Very extremely talented. Could potentially even later on be the threat for the number 1 pound for pound fighter. But you can't be on that Canelo Alvarez level or the level of some of these other fighters that are on my pound for pound list when the biggest fight of your career is against Leo Santa Cruz. It just is what it is, and I don't even think he had a belt at the time, so it's like, come on. That's like, Terrence Crawford when he just recently beat Sean Porter. Excellent, excellent win, but that's not going to put you at the number 1 pound for pound spot.
I got to start saying this more often because it's causing a lot of confusion. There's a group of black people on the internet that are going after like all of the black big name fighters, from Gervonta Tank Davis to Terrence Crawford to Floyd Mayweather to the whole PBC organization, because it's causing a lot of confusion on the internet. I want to make it very clear, these group of black people, they have nothing to do with new media. Everything you guys are going to hear on my channel, and when I say new media, I'm talking about me and I'm talking about Aki. Everything you guys are going to hear
the dope duo. Anyway,
say it's going to,
and by that of course I mean idiot ass duo, but it is what it is. Or the decaf duo, maybe that's what we should start calling them, because Aki TV and Dante's Boxing Nation never know what the hell they're talking about. They always make the dumbest points when it comes down to they have no logic and objectivity, but it is what it is.
Be nothing but the whole truth, and it's going to be backed up with facts. Like I said, it is a complete fact that Canelo Alvarez is not fighting against undefeated black or Mexican fighters. It's a fact that Tank Davis is fighting against all of the best Mexican fighters. If there was...
No, he's not. That's not a fact at all. That's a fallacy. How can you be facing against the best Mexican fighters when you're not even facing the number one Mexican fighter in that division. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that Isaac Cruz is not a decent fighter, but don't sit here and tell me that Isaac Cruz is, a better ranked fighter than Ryan Garcia. Like, come on. Even if you wanted to say that Isaac Cruz was above Ryan Garcia, don't tell me that Mario Barrios was the best Mexican or Latino fighter within the 140-pound division. I mean, come on, man. Like, what does he accomplish there? He can't be above Jose Ramirez, a person who was a former somewhat unified champion in that division. Like, come on.
An undefeated Mexican fighter right now that was fighting nothing but the best black fighters. Just in his own weight class, forget about 3 different weight classes. Imagine if it was a Mexican.
3 different weight classes. Gervonta Tank Davis fought Leo Santa Cruz at 130. Leo Santa Cruz was not even the number one ranked Mexican fighter of that division when Gervonta Tank fought him. Shit, he wasn't even the second. It was Oscar Valdez and Miguel Berchelt. So he's trying to say that, he's facing the best Mexican fighters. No, he's not. He's facing, the third best ranked Mexican fighters of each and every division. Don't get me wrong. Those Mexican fighters are still very talented. But don't sell me this narrative of the spoon of bullshit that Gervonta Tank Davis is facing, the all around best Mexican in each division. No, he's not.
Fighting nothing but the best, most dangerous black fighters.
That's like if Canelo Alvarez next, like, instead of facing David Benavidez, he fought like a Jaime Munguia. And that's like me saying, what are you guys talking about? Canelo, he's facing the best Mexican option available. Like, no, he's not. Like, come on, man. That's just stupid.
Refuse to fight another Mexican. Would anyone be saying, oh, man, this guy's just cherry picking? They would never.
Another great fight actually on the horizon, and I forgot about this fighter. That could be for Mr. Saul Canelo Alvarez. Gilberto Zurdo Ramirez. That's an excellent fight. Those two, I believe, were former sparring partners as well. That'd be a huge fight. That'd be a very, very big dollar fight.
Never say that, because deep down they look at the black fighters as the most dangerous fighters for their favorite fighters to go up against. This is the reason why they're always making excuses for why they don't want to see these dangerous fights.
I agree with you there sometimes, Dante. Like I said, there's a lot of people all know that, know that a lot of these black fighters, they can tend to be the most talented or dangerous. But like I said, deep down that Canelo Alvarez is truly the number one pound for pound fighter. That's why you tear him down so much. That's why you talk about him so much.
Let them tell it. Charlo, Andre, they don't deserve to fight Canelo. But Yildirim, Rocky Fielding, McAboo, Plant, Saunders, they do deserve to fight against Canelo Alvarez. If it's up to these boxing fans, do you think they would rather see Kambosos versus Lomachenko or Kambosos versus Devin Haney?
Well, that depends. Like I said, Lomachenko, when it comes down to a lot of the Caucasian demographic, they want to see Lomachenko get back on top. And of course, that's just natural. They want to see their guy overall get back on top. So of course, they're going to want to see Lomachenko get that opportunity. It just is what it is. Now, what fight do I think should happen next? Well, I think as long as the fight, all in all, is a very decently competitive fight, I don't necessarily have a problem with it. So, George Kambosos, as long as it's along the lines of a Ryan Garcia, Vasyl Lomachenko, Devin Haney, or Gervonta Tank Davis, I don't really have a problem with any of those fights. Now, if he were to face someone like a Rolly Romero next, or a Jojo Diaz, I mean, those guys, they may be able to attract some people, but, those, in my opinion, are not acceptable fights.
No, these are the same fans that's always talking big about undisputed and all the belts, etc., etc. The truth is, we know the answer to my question. When it comes to Devin Haney being involved, they don't care anything about undisputed. And when it's Kambosos versus Lomachenko, as long as there's no fighter on the coincidental list, it's a win-win situation for these type of fans. So let's see how Canelo Alvarez gets out of this situation. Does he create another Canelo weight class like he did when he was at 154, where he was having welterweights come up to catch weights? He was having fighters at heavier weight classes come down to catch weights. Let's see how Canelo Alvarez is going to navigate through these dangerous streets when it comes to his new match.
Well, like I said, when it comes down to it, if he does face people at 175, which I predict more than likely he will, you will have to give him credit, but I don't think you will. So it is what it is, but we'll see what happens.
Mandatories to be at 168. That's all I got for now, guys. On to the next one. All right, now check this.
And anyways, that's really about it for this video. But it'll be very, very interesting to see what Mr. Saul Canelo Alvarez does next. Like I said, if I had to predict, more than likely the fighter he's going to go after next is Mr. Joe Smith Jr. So we'll see after the Makabu fight. So we'll see what happens. That's, of course, assuming that Canelo Alvarez is able to get past Olunga Makabu, which I do predict he will. But we'll see what happens. Anyways, that's really about it for today. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll talk to you all later.